There is a quiet immaturity hiding inside many confident minds. It does not scream or collapse. It simply insists it is always right. Emotionally immature thinking rarely looks childish. It often sounds logical, calm, and reasonable, which is why it goes unnoticed for so long. You may have felt it during an argument, a strange certainty that refuses doubt, even as evidence quietly piles up around it. This mindset does not feel weak to the person inside it. It feels protective, justified, and even necessary for survival. The unsettling part is not that others think this way. It is realizing how easily anyone can slip into it without noticing. Emotionally immature thinking is less about intelligence, more about how the mind protects itself from emotional discomfort. It hides behind confidence, certainty, and moral positioning, making self-reflection feel like a threat rather than curiosity. Most people never question this pattern because questioning it feels like losing control, and control feels like safety. But what if that sense of control is built on something fragile, something learned early and never re-examined? Before we look closer, ask yourself quietly, where in your life does certainty feel more important than understanding? Imagine a person who speaks calmly during conflict, explaining their position slowly, believing their tone proves control while the room grows quietly tense. Picture someone planning every conversation in advance, rehearsing responses alone at night, convinced preparation equals strength as relationships feel increasingly scripted. Imagine another person insisting they are unfazed by criticism, smiling lightly, claiming indifference while replaying every comment internally for days. In each scene, control feels present, not through force, but through certainty. Certainty that emotions are mastered rather than merely contained. Emotionally immature thinking often mistakes emotional suppression for regulation, confusing silence with stability and rigidity with inner strength over time. Control becomes a performance, a way to avoid vulnerability, because vulnerability introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the image of competence. Rather than feeling emotions as they arise, the mind jumps ahead, organizing narratives that explain why nothing is actually wrong. This creates an illusion of mastery, where reactions are labeled decisions, and discomfort is reframed as proof of resilience alone. The person feels in charge because nothing appears chaotic, yet the absence of chaos is maintained through constant internal effort. What looks like composure is often vigilance, a watchful state scanning for threats to self-image and emotional equilibrium constantly. Emotionally immature control relies on predictability, keeping interactions narrow, limiting spontaneity, because surprise invites feelings that cannot be managed instantly. Over time, this pattern feels safer than openness, safer than curiosity, safer than admitting emotional confusion in real moments together. The illusion strengthens because it reduces immediate anxiety, offering relief without resolution, calm without understanding, and distance from uncomfortable self-awareness. In this state, control feels earned, like a personal achievement, reinforcing the belief that emotional maturity has already been reached. Yet, this belief quietly depends on avoidance, avoiding depth, avoiding contradiction, avoiding the messiness of shared emotional reality with others. As long as situations remain familiar, the illusion holds, but unfamiliar pressure exposes how thin that control actually is inside. Emotionally immature thinking avoids this exposure, preferring environments where reactions are predictable and roles are rarely challenged or questioned openly. The person may genuinely believe they are emotionally advanced, because nothing feels out of control within these narrow boundaries anymore. But control maintained this way is conditional, dependent on others cooperating and circumstances staying comfortably known without emotional disruption appearing. When those conditions break, something cracks beneath the surface, revealing a deeper pattern not yet visible, and that is where the story turns. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Imagine a person who prides themselves on staying calm, until a simple disagreement unexpectedly tightens their voice and sharpens their words. They insist they are only defending logic, yet their chest feels heavy and their thoughts race faster than the conversation itself. The other person withdraws slightly, sensing tension, while our calm individual grows more determined to prove their stability. What appears as firmness is actually fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing narrative control, fear of appearing inadequate. Emotionally immature thinking reveals its first crack when disagreement feels like a threat rather than a difference in perspective. The discomfort is not about the topic itself, it is about what the disagreement implies about identity and worth. Instead of asking what can be learned, the mind asks how to regain superiority and restore emotional equilibrium quickly. This shift happens so fast it feels natural, almost justified, as if self-protection is the same as clarity. The crack widens when the person later replays the event, editing the memory to emphasize their rationality. They remember their points clearly, but blur the emotional undercurrent that shaped their tone and intensity. Emotionally immature thinking protects self-image by simplifying complexity, reducing relational tension into right versus wrong. In doing so, it removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is intolerable because it demands emotional endurance rather than control. The first crack is subtle, rarely dramatic, more like a quiet rigidity that appears under pressure. A small comment feels disproportionately personal, a boundary feels like rejection, a delay feels like abandonment. Instead of recognizing these reactions as internal echoes, the mind externalizes them as proof of others' flaws. The belief in control begins to wobble when repeated conflicts follow similar patterns despite different circumstances. At that point, a deeper question emerges, not about others' behavior, but about the internal script driving reactions. Emotionally immature thinking avoids that question because answering it requires confronting unresolved emotional learning from earlier experiences. The crack therefore becomes something to seal quickly through justification, distancing, or moral positioning. Yet beneath that repair attempt lies something older than the current argument, something formed long before this relationship began. To understand why the mind clings to this pattern so tightly, we need to examine how it was built in the first place. Imagine a child who learns that strong emotions lead to disapproval, who watches caregivers withdraw when tears or anger appear. Picture that child deciding quietly that certain feelings are dangerous, storing them away while practicing composure to maintain connection. Over time, that composure becomes praised, labeled mature, responsible, and strong, reinforcing the belief that emotional restraint equals safety. The brain adapts quickly to patterns that reduce discomfort, wiring associations between suppression and belonging, certainty and approval. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. Conditioning does not announce itself as limitation. It presents as identity, shaping automatic responses long before conscious thought intervenes. Neural pathways strengthen around what is repeatedly rewarded, and avoidance of emotional discomfort becomes neurologically efficient. The brain prioritizes energy conservation, favoring familiar reactions over uncertain exploration, especially in emotionally charged situations. When emotional expression once led to instability, suppression becomes encoded as protection rather than restriction. Emotionally immature thinking is often less about unwillingness and more about deeply reinforced neural shortcuts. These shortcuts reduce cognitive load, offering immediate clarity in complex interpersonal dynamics, even when that clarity is incomplete. The mind categorizes experiences quickly, labeling threats, assigning blame, constructing narratives that restore internal order. Each time this happens without reflection, the pathway deepens, making alternative responses feel unnatural or even unsafe. Over years, this conditioning blends into personality, making rigidity appear principled and defensiveness appear assertive. The brain rewards predictability because unpredictability once felt overwhelming or destabilizing in earlier environments. Certainty triggers a sense of control, releasing subtle relief that reinforces the behavior again and again. Emotionally immature patterns therefore persist, not because they are effective long-term, but because they soothe immediately. Immediate soothing outweighs delayed insight, especially when insight requires tolerating emotional ambiguity. The brain seeks resolution quickly, and rigid interpretations provide that resolution even if they distort reality. In this way, immaturity becomes adaptive in the short term, protecting attachment, and self-image simultaneously. Over time, the individual may genuinely believe their reactions are objective, unaware of the conditioning beneath them. The brain is not concerned with growth. It is concerned with survival and energy efficiency above all else. This creates a paradox where the very mechanisms that once ensured safety now limit relational depth and flexibility. Emotionally immature thinking therefore persists because it is biologically, economical, and psychologically familiar. The individual feels consistent, coherent, and stable, which reinforces the narrative of maturity. Yet beneath that stability lies a quieter truth. The brain benefits from this pattern more than the relationships do. And once we recognize that benefit, another layer becomes visible, one that explains why letting go feels so threatening. Emotionally immature thinking persists because it provides something valuable, something subtle that feels too important to surrender. It offers a stable self-image, one where the individual remains rational, consistent, and morally positioned above emotional chaos. There is relief in believing you are the composed one, the reasonable one, the misunderstood but principled presence in conflict. This belief shields against shame, because if others are reactive or flawed, the self remains intact and unchallenged. The hidden payoff is protection from inadequacy, protection from the suspicion that one might be partially responsible. Accepting emotional complexity requires admitting influence, and influence introduces vulnerability into carefully maintained narratives. Immature thinking avoids this by simplifying interactions into clear categories, preserving certainty at the expense of nuance. There is also a quieter reward, the avoidance of grief over unmet needs from earlier experiences. If those needs are acknowledged, old disappointment resurfaces, and that emotional weight feels destabilizing. By staying certain and controlled, the mind avoids reopening unresolved attachment wounds. Another payoff emerges in power dynamics, where emotional distance can create an advantage in tense conversations. Remaining detached while others express emotion can feel like winning without raising one's voice. This reinforces the pattern because dominance, even subtle dominance, feels safer than mutual exposure. Emotionally immature thinking therefore becomes intertwined with pride, making reconsideration feel like humiliation. The ego invests in the narrative of strength, defending it against any evidence of fragility. When someone suggests growth or reflection, it can be interpreted as criticism rather than invitation. The payoff is not only internal comfort, but also external consistency. Relationships remain predictable within controlled limits. Predictability reduces anxiety, even if it reduces intimacy at the same time. There is comfort in knowing how one will react, even if those reactions repeat familiar conflicts. Letting go of this pattern would mean entering unfamiliar emotional territory without guaranteed outcomes. For a mind conditioned to value certainty, that feels like stepping into instability. So the hidden payoff is both safety and superiority, woven together in ways that feel inseparable. Until that connection is examined more closely, the pattern will continue to defend itself quietly and persistently. And this defense gradually solidifies into something deeper than behavior, something closer to identity itself. Imagine a person who has always been described as strong, the dependable one who never overreacts or shows too much emotion. They begin to internalize this description, shaping their behavior to maintain the image others expect from them. When moments of vulnerability arise, they feel inconsistent with who this person believes they are supposed to be. Instead of exploring that discomfort, they reinforce composure, strengthening the identity that has earned approval for years. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. Over time, emotionally immature reactions become indistinguishable from personality traits, defended as authenticity rather than adaptation. Statements like "this is just how I am" begin to close doors that curiosity once left open. Identity solidifies around control, certainty, and emotional distance, making flexibility feel like betrayal of self. Challenges to these patterns are experienced as attacks on character rather than observations about behavior. This is the identity trap, where growth feels like erasure and reflection feels like self-doubt. The person may resist new emotional experiences because they conflict with the established narrative of strength. Admitting emotional confusion could threaten years of reinforcement built on predictability and rational positioning. The brain prefers coherence, and changing identity introduces cognitive dissonance that feels deeply uncomfortable. Emotionally immature thinking protects against that discomfort by doubling down on familiar interpretations. Even when relationships suffer, the identity remains protected because preserving self-image feels more urgent. This trap is subtle because it does not feel restrictive from the inside. It feels principled, consistent, and stable, qualities that are socially rewarded and admired. Yet beneath that stability is a fear of fragmentation, a fear that without rigid definitions the self might dissolve. Identity built on emotional avoidance cannot easily tolerate contradiction without perceiving it as weakness. As long as the person equates composure with worth, they will struggle to question the underlying pattern. The trap tightens each time vulnerability is dismissed internally as unnecessary or dramatic. Eventually, the individual no longer sees alternative ways of relating as viable for someone like them. And this raises a difficult realization. The pattern is no longer something they do. It is who they believe they are. At a certain point, emotionally immature thinking can be observed without immediate judgment, not as failure, but as an internal structure formed under pressure. This perspective does not excuse harm or dismiss consequences. It simply shifts attention from blame toward pattern recognition. Instead of asking who is wrong, the frame quietly asks what function this reaction serves within the inner system. Control is no longer treated as virtue or flaw, but as a response that once solved a problem efficiently. Certainty becomes understandable as an attempt to stabilize identity rather than proof of insight or maturity. From this angle, rigidity is not stubbornness. It is a protective boundary drawn too early and never updated. Emotional distance stops looking cold and starts looking like insulation applied when closeness once felt unsafe. The mind appears less defensive when its logic is seen as a tool rather than a verdict. This reframing does not rush toward change. It slows perception enough to notice repetition without immediately intervening. Patterns become visible across situations, similar emotional shortcuts appearing in different relationships and contexts. The individual may begin noticing how quickly narratives form, how fast conclusions replace curiosity. There is a difference between explanation and observation, and this frame stays firmly in observation. It allows contradictions to exist temporarily, without demanding resolution or moral ranking. Emotional immaturity under this lens is not an insult. It is a developmental pause that never resumed. That pause often occurred before language was available to articulate internal experience clearly. Recognizing this does not dissolve the pattern, but it changes the relationship to it. The self is no longer fused with reactions, creating psychological space without forcing transformation. That space is quiet and sometimes unsettling because it removes familiar justifications. Yet within that discomfort, something new becomes possible, a different kind of awareness not yet defined. And that awareness does not arrive loudly. It begins subtly, reshaping perception before behavior follows. This shift does not announce itself with insight or relief. It often feels like uncertainty without immediate explanation. Familiar reactions still arise, but they are accompanied by a slight delay, a pause before full identification. The mind notices its own movement, the urge to simplify or defend, without immediately obeying it. That noticing feels neutral, neither condemning nor approving, just present. Emotional intensity may feel sharper at first, because avoidance is no longer automatic. This can feel like regression, when it is actually exposure to unfiltered experience. Certainty loses some of its grip, not because it disappears, but because it no longer feels mandatory. Silence inside conversations becomes more noticeable, not as threat, but as space. The individual may feel less sure how to position themselves and more aware of emotional nuance. This awareness does not create answers. It creates tolerance for not having them. Relationships may feel slightly unfamiliar because old scripts no longer fully apply. There is less impulse to categorize interactions immediately as success or failure. The mind becomes less efficient but more accurate, trading speed for depth. This trade can feel uncomfortable because efficiency once provided emotional safety. Yet something steadier begins to replace it, a quiet groundedness without performance. Control loosens into presence, not through effort, but through reduced urgency. Nothing dramatic changes outwardly, but internally the narrative softens. Reactions still occur, but they pass through awareness rather than defining identity. This is not resolution, it is recalibration, a subtle internal realignment. And in that recalibration, a final question begins to take shape, one that brings everything back to the self. Eventually, the focus turns inward without accusation, as if standing before a mirror that reflects patterns rather than flaws. The question is no longer why others react this way, but why certain reactions feel inevitable within you. Emotionally immature thinking appears less like a defect and more like an inherited script still being performed. That script contains familiar lines about strength, logic, independence, and emotional composure. It also contains unspoken fears about rejection, inadequacy, and losing internal structure. Looking into this mirror requires tolerating ambiguity about who you are beyond those lines. There may be discomfort in recognizing how often certainty replaced curiosity in close relationships. Moments once remembered as justified may now feel incomplete when viewed from this angle. The mirror does not accuse. It reveals patterns repeating across different names and circumstances. It shows how protection sometimes disguised itself as principle. It shows how distance sometimes masqueraded as dignity. Emotionally immature thinking becomes visible in small reflexes, subtle shifts in tone, and silent internal conclusions. These details were always present, but rarely examined with patience. The mirror also reflects resilience, because these patterns once kept something fragile intact. Acknowledging that does not romanticize them, it contextualizes them. There is gravity in realizing how much of identity was shaped by early emotional negotiations. Some people may feel resistance here, a desire to step away from this reflection. Others may feel relief, as if something unnamed has finally been articulated internally. The mirror remains neutral regardless of reaction, offering no verdict. It simply invites sustained attention, without forcing interpretation. And as you stand there observing, one quiet thought lingers: what remains when certainty is set aside? Emotionally immature thinking does not disappear because it has been understood, it lingers in subtle forms. Awareness does not erase conditioning. It only changes the way it is experienced. There will still be moments of defensiveness, moments of quick interpretation, and silent internal closure. The difference lies in whether those moments define identity or pass through it. Growth in this context is not dramatic transformation, it is reduced automaticity. It is the ability to witness a reaction forming without immediately calling it truth. This witnessing feels ordinary, almost anticlimactic, yet it reshapes internal experience gradually. Emotionally immature patterns thrive in certainty and invisibility. When certainty softens and invisibility fades, their intensity often decreases naturally. No declaration is required, no announcement of change. Only a quieter relationship with the parts of you that once felt unquestionable. Some viewers may recognize these patterns clearly in others. Some may sense fragments of themselves within this description. Neither reaction is superior. Both are part of the same human architecture. The mind protects before it reflects. The question is not whether immaturity exists, but how closely you are willing to observe it. SciHow exists to explore these inner mechanics without judgment or performance. If this reflection stayed with you, let it continue unfolding privately. Because the most important shifts rarely happen during the video. They happen later, in the silence after certainty loosens its grip.